Imagine waking up to find that the massive, impenetrable wall of ice protecting your backyard is just, well, melting, like rapidly melting.
Yeah, right in front of you.
Right. And the heavily armed neighbor who always, kept an eye on your front door, they just kind of hinted they might stop answering your calls.
Which is terrifying.
It is. And that is the stark, immediate reality for Canada right now in 2026. We are looking at a nation with the world's longest coastline suddenly realizing its maritime shield has these massive gaping holes.
It's a profound vulnerability.
Yeah.
I mean, truly. And military planners, they aren't treating this as some hypothetical future scenario anymore. It's a 5-alarm fire today.
Yeah.
The strategic recalculation happening right now is, well, it's unprecedented in modern Canadian history.
Exactly. So we've spent the week poring over these dense naval briefing books, candid interviews from military brass, and some heavily redacted strategic reviews to basically answer one question. How does a country rebuild its naval wall from scratch?
A huge undertaking.
A massive one. So today's deep dive is an exploration of the blueprint for the Royal Canadian Navy's complete overhaul. The goal is to build a 55-ship fleet for the 21st century.
Which is an astronomical number when you get down to the logistics.
It really is. And for you listening right now, this goes far beyond, niche military hardware. This is about national sovereignty. It's about the protection of global trade routes that, frankly, dictate the price of your groceries.
Absolutely. It affects everything.
It's about how a middle-power country navigates an incredibly fractured world. But before we get into the weeds of $84 billion budgets and, drone swarms, let's establish a quick baseline. For the listener who doesn't have a Dow dictionary handy, can you give us the sort of T-shirt sizing for the ships we'll be talking about today?
Yeah, that is a helpful starting point, actually. Think of naval vessels in 3 broad tiers: small, medium, and large.
Okay.
Small, medium, large. Got it. Right. So the small tier, relatively speaking anyway, is the Corvette. This is roughly 2,000 to 3,000 tons. It's fast, nimble, and it's basically designed for coastal defense and patrolling your immediate waterways.
Kind of like a heavy-duty patrol car.
Exactly. Now, the medium tier is the frigate. We are talking 4,000 to maybe 6,000 tons. The frigate is the traditional workhorse of the fleet. It's capable of crossing oceans, escorting convoys, and hunting submarines.
The everyday heavy lifter.
Right. Then you have the large tier, the destroyer. At 8,000 tons or more, a modern destroyer is essentially a floating fortress.
Wow.
Yeah, it carries massive radar systems and heavy missile batteries designed to completely dominate the airspace and protect an entire fleet from incoming threats.
Okay, so corvettes for the coast, frigates for the everyday heavy lifting, and destroyers for the absolute highest-end combat.
That's the basic breakdown, yeah.
Now that we have the vocabulary, let's look at why Canada is suddenly trying to buy so many of these all at once. Because, what broke the status quo? For the last 30 years, the status quo seemed completely fine to most people.
It seemed fine, but it was fragile.
Right. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a line that, it essentially serves as the thesis for this entire naval rebuild. He said, "This is a rupture. There is no going back, nor should we."
And rupture is an incredibly strong, deliberate word choice in the lexicon of international diplomacy. They don't use that lightly.
No, they definitely don't.
It signifies the death of the foundational assumptions that have guided Canadian defense policy since, really, the fall of the Berlin Wall. The operating theory for decades was just deterrence through coalition.
Right, we didn't need to do it all ourselves.
Exactly. Canada didn't believe it needed a massive, fully independent, full-spectrum navy. The plan was always to act as a highly capable auxiliary force. You build a few good frigates, you plug them into a United States-led carrier strike group or a NATO task force, and you just let the superpower do the heavy lifting of global deterrence.
We were the reliable sidekick. We bring the specialized anti-submarine gear, we park right next to the American aircraft carrier, and we just consider our sovereignty protected by proximity.
Yeah, protected by proximity. But that dynamic is over. The geopolitical tectonic plates have completely shifted.
How so? Exactly.
Well, in the East, you have an expansionist Russia actively working to dismantle the rules-based international order. Combine that with a Chinese Navy that is, frankly, pumping out advanced warships at a rate we haven't seen since the Second World War.
It's staggering.
It is. But the most jarring shift for Canadian planners is actually the shifting view of the United States.
Yeah, I want to spend some time on this because it features really heavily in the sources we looked at. The analysis from Adam Lajeunesse at St. Francis Xavier University, alongside some editorial insights from Photo Motoman, points to a growing anxiety in Canadian defense circles regarding U.S. politics.
A very deep anxiety.
The intelligence assessment is that under figures like J.D. Vance or Donald Trump, the United States is transitioning into a highly transactional, isolationist power. The traditional assumption that the U.S. will automatically act as a reliable ally, unconditionally supporting Canadian sovereignty just because we share a border, well, it's severely in doubt.
Right.
And I want to be absolutely clear to you, the listener, right now. We are not making a value judgment on American domestic politics.
Nada.
We are not taking left-wing or right-wing sides here. We are strictly, impartially reporting the risk assessments that are currently driving Canadian military strategy as outlined in these documents.
Because military planners do not have the luxury of banking on best-case scenarios. They deal in risk management. Period.
Yeah, they have to plan for the worst.
Right. If the nation supplying your security umbrella is viewed as even potentially transactional, a sovereign nation has to adjust its posture immediately. Lajeunesse points out that this hyper-nationalistic, sort of America First viewpoint down south means Canada cannot expect to be treated as an equal partner without bringing its own substantial independent capabilities to the table.
You have to pay to play, essentially.
Exactly. Vice Admiral Angus Topshee, who's the head of the Navy, held this remarkably blunt town hall with his officers in Halifax. He told them, "We need to know everything that's happening under our waters. We're building a Navy that can do that."
That's a huge shift in tone.
It is. He essentially issued a mandate to prepare to go it alone.
It's kind of like living in an apartment building where the landlord always provided the security guards, the perimeter cameras, and the reinforced doors. You just paid your rent and didn't really worry about it.
Right, it was just handled.
But suddenly, the landlord slides a memo under your door saying, hey, from now on, security is a la carte. If you want a guard, you pay extra, and honestly, we might not even answer the phone when you call. You can't just cross your fingers and hope the building stays safe. You have to go out and buy your own alarm system, wire your own cameras, and reinforce your own windows. And you have to pay for it out of your own pocket right now.
And crucially, you have to learn how to monitor that alarm system yourself. You can't just outsource it anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
So the Canadian response to this geopolitical landlord memo is the 55-ship fleet. It is a total paradigm shift from being a niche contributor in an allied fleet to building a top-to-bottom, fully sovereign maritime capability.
So if Canada is suddenly forced to build its own comprehensive security system, what are the biggest, most expensive pieces of that system? Like the things that do the really heavy lifting.
Right, the core fleet.
Yeah, that brings us to the core fleet, these high-end warfighting assets. And the sticker shock we are seeing in these briefing documents is truly something to behold.
Impressive.
The centerpiece of this new fleet is the River-class destroyer. This is the ship intended to replace the aging Halifax-class frigates, right? It's based on a British design, BAE's Type 26. Now, originally, the budget for 15 of these ships was projected at $26 billion. But a recent report by the Parliamentary Budget Officer states the cost has skyrocketed to $84 billion.
Yeah.
And deliveries are stretching into the 2030s, with the final ship not even arriving until 2050. How does a defense project triple in cost before the first ship even hits the water? I mean, $84 billion.
Well, the $84 billion figure requires a massive amount of context because it is currently causing an absolute public relations disaster for the Department of National Defense.
I can imagine.
It makes the procurement process look catastrophically mismanaged. But the root of that $84 billion number is actually largely tied to a bureaucratic accounting method. It's called life cycle costing, or LCC.
Right. Adam Lajeunesse wrote a very critical brief on this exact topic. Can you explain what life cycle costing actually is and how it's, well, kind of distorting the public's perception of these destroyers?
Okay, so the Department of National Defense is mandated by the Treasury Board to use life cycle costing. It is not an optional accounting trick. It's a strict federal requirement.
Okay.
Life cycle costing means you must aggregate every single actual and projected cost associated with that ship for its entire lifespan. We are talking 30 to 40 years into the future.
Wow.
Yeah. So it includes the design phase, the raw steel, the shipyard labor, the testing, but it also includes the estimated price of marine diesel fuel it will burn in the year 2045.
Wait, hold on. Predicting the price of marine diesel fuel or the rate of inflation 4 decades from now, that isn't accounting. That's like reading tea leaves.
It really relies on incredibly speculative variables. If an economist tweaks the projected inflation rate by just a fraction of a percent for the year 2040, the spreadsheet adds billions of dollars to the total project cost today.
That's wild.
It includes the salaries, benefits, and pensions of the sailors, who literally haven't even been born yet. It includes the midlife maintenance refits planned for the 2040s, the infrastructure upgrades required at the naval bases in Halifax and Esquimalt just to dock the ships, right down to the environmental cost of scrapping the ship in the 2060s.
There's everything, from cradle to grave.
Exactly. But the real damage to public perception comes from international comparisons. Most allied navies, specifically the United States and the United Kingdom, they do not publicly report life cycle costs for their major platforms. They report what is called acquisition costs, or the sail-away price.
The sail-away price, meaning just the cost to cut the steel, install the engines, and drive the finished ship off the lot.
Correct. So when the Canadian public sees a headline saying Canada's spending $84 billion for 15 ships, and then they look across the border and see an allied country spending, say, $20 billion for 15 ships, it creates a deeply misleading narrative.
It's an extreme apples to oranges comparison. We are publishing the cost of the car, the gas for 30 years, the insurance, the oil changes, and the driver's salary, while the other guy is just publishing the sticker price on the windshield.
And La Jeunesse points out the real danger of this. When voters see these headline figures in the tens of billions, it generates genuine shock. It completely erodes political support for the Navy.
Right.
It leads to parliamentary inquiries, intense scrutiny, and ultimately project delays. And ironically, delaying a massive shipbuilding program is the single fastest way to increase its actual cost, because inflation and supply chain costs just continue to rise while you argue about it.
So the complaining makes it more expensive.
Exactly. La Jeunesse argues strongly that D&D needs to find a way to harmonize its public accounting methodologies with its allies to restore trust.
That reframes the $84 billion entirely. Now, alongside these massive surface destroyers, the other ultra-expensive asset is the submarine fleet. The briefing notes detail a plan to buy 12 conventionally powered air-independent propulsion submarines. This is to replace the 4 old Victoria-class subs by 2035. The first question that jumps out is the number. Why 12? Like, why not 6 or 8?
The number 12 is dictated by the brutal mathematics of naval engineering and submarine maintenance.
Okay.
Planners call it the rule of 4. If a Navy wants to guarantee having one submarine actually at sea, actively patrolling, it needs 4 submarines in the total fleet.
That sounds like an incredibly inefficient use of billions of dollars. Why does a submarine need so much more downtime than, say, a passenger jet or even a space shuttle?
Because a submarine operates in the absolute most hostile, unforgiving environment on Earth, the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. Every single time a submarine dives, the immense weight of the water physically compresses the steel hull. When it surfaces, the hull expands. Over time, this causes major metal fatigue. The maintenance requirements to ensure that pressure hull doesn't catastrophically implode are just staggering.
So it's not like you just change the oil and go back out.
Not at all. So, in a fleet of 12, here is how the math breaks down. 3 submarines are at high readiness, ready to deploy or already at sea. That gives you 1 to patrol the Pacific, 1 for the Atlantic, and 1 to cover the Arctic approaches.
Okay, so that's 3 out on patrol.
Yeah.
Where are the other 9 boats?
3 submarines are dedicated entirely to training the next generation of submariners and force generation. Because you can't train a submarine crew in a classroom. They need a physical boat.
Makes sense.
Then another 3 are in lower-level routine maintenance. Fixing worn pumps, updating software, repairing minor wear and tear. And the final 3 are in what's called deep depot maintenance.
Which sounds intense.
It is. This is a process that takes several years. The submarine is literally cut open.
Cut open.
Yes. Heavy machinery, like the main diesel engines, are ripped out and refurbished. Every single valve and weld on the pressure hull is x-rayed for microscopic stress fractures. It is basically rebuilding the boat from scratch. So 12 sounds like a massive fleet, but it is the absolute bare minimum required to maintain a continuous 3-ocean presence.
Wow, that makes the engineering reality painfully clear. The documents also mention that these 12 new subs will feature AIP, or air-independent propulsion. The contenders listed are Spain's S-80 from Navantia, Germany's Type 212CD, South Korea's Dosan Changho, and Sweden's C-71. But what exactly is AIP? Wait, submarines need air. I thought the whole point was that they stay underwater.
Well, nuclear submarines can stay underwater indefinitely, limited really only by the food they carry. But Canada's buying conventionally powered submarines. Traditional conventional subs run large marine diesel engines to generate electricity, which charges massive battery banks. To run a diesel engine, you need oxygen. So a traditional sub has to regularly come up near the surface and stick a tube, a snorkel, above the waves to suck in air and blow out diesel exhaust.
And sticking a metal pipe above the waves makes you visible to enemy radar.
Exactly, it makes you a target. Anti-submarine aircraft look for that snorkel on radar, or they use infrared sensors to detect the hot diesel exhaust. Air-independent propulsion changes the game mechanically. An AIP submarine carries its own supply of liquid oxygen on board in highly pressurized tanks.
Oh, clever.
It uses this oxygen, often combined with hydrogen, to feed specialized fuel cells. These fuel cells generate electricity chemically. There are no moving engine parts, no diesel exhaust, and total silence.
How long does that let them stay hidden?
A traditional diesel sub might need a snorkel every few days. An AIP submarine can remain submerged and practically invisible for weeks at a time. It turns a coastal defense boat into a highly lethal, long-endurance predator.
Okay, so we are building this high-tech wall of AIP subs and 15 River-class destroyers. But here is where the deep dive gets really contentious. Not everyone agrees with the River-class plan. The Canadian Defense Review published a rather radical alternative proposal for the surface fleet that basically says, stop trying to build these domestically.
Yes, the off-the-shelf argument. It's a very compelling thought experiment rooted in the reality of those massive delays we discussed. The argument is that Canada's domestic shipyards simply cannot produce ships fast enough to meet the immediate threat environment.
The proposal suggests capping the domestically built River-class destroyers at just 3 ships. Basically, cut your losses. Take the remaining billions of dollars and buy proven, off-the-shelf warships from our allies who have massive, highly efficient shipbuilding industries. Specifically, they suggest buying 4 United States Arleigh Burke Flight 3rd destroyers and a large fleet of Japanese Mogami-class frigates. So, I have to ask, if allies are churning out off-the-shelf ships faster and cheaper, is our insistence on building these massive River-class ships in Halifax just a matter of political pride, or is it a strategic necessity?
It is the ultimate tension between immediate military capability and long-term sovereign industrial capacity. Let's look at the immediate military capability first. The argument for the Arleigh Burke destroyers is purely about elite, high-end lethality. The Flight 3 Burke is arguably the most capable air defense warship ever built. Its defining feature is the AN/SPY-6 radar.
The briefing notes emphasize this radar specifically.
Yep.
What makes the SPY-6 so much better than what we are putting on the River-class?
Well, radar is fundamentally about emitting radio waves and listening for the echo to bounce back.
Right.
The SPY-6 uses a material called gallium nitride in its transmitters. This allows it to push out vastly more power and receive incredibly faint echoes without, melting its own components. It is so sensitive it can track objects half the size at twice the distance of previous systems. It can track over 30 times the number of targets simultaneously.
But why does tracking an object half the size matter so much? A fighter jet is a fighter jet.
Because the threat isn't just fighter jets anymore. The SPY-6 is designed for ballistic missile defense, or BMD. We are talking about tracking an enemy warhead that has been launched into the upper atmosphere, traveling at Mach 15 or 20, falling back toward a city. Yeah, it is a tiny, incredibly fast-moving target. The River-class, by comparison, uses the SPY-7 radar. While highly capable, its planned configuration on the Canadian ships uses fewer radar modules, and the specific missiles Canada is buying for the River-class cannot currently conduct ballistic missile interceptions in outer space. Furthermore, the Arleigh Burke has 96 vertical launch cells for missiles compared to the River-class's 32. It's just a much heavier hitter.
And what about the other half of this off-the-shelf proposal, the Japanese Mogami-class frigates? Why are they pitched as the solution for the rest of the fleet?
Economics and extreme automation. The Japanese shipyards are currently building the Mogami class at a staggering rate of 3 ships per year. The procurement cost is estimated in the low $300 million range per ship, which is a fraction of the River-class cost. But the real genius is inside the ship. A traditional Canadian Halifax-class frigate, or the future River-class, requires a crew of about 225 sailors to operate the sensors, the engines, and the weapons. The Mogami class is designed to be fully operated by a crew of just 90.
Wait, 90 sailors? For a full-size frigate, that doesn't even sound like enough people for damage control if the ship gets hit.
It is a massive technological leap. The ship relies on highly centralized digital control centers and autonomous internal systems. For a Navy like Canada's, which is facing a severe personnel retention crisis, the ability to cut your crew requirement, by more than half, while maintaining formidable anti-submarine and anti-surface capabilities, is incredibly attractive.
So why not just do it? Buy the Burkes, buy the Modamis, and get the fleet in the water by 2030.
Because of the national shipbuilding strategy, canceling the River class would devastate the domestic shipyards in Halifax. It would wipe out thousands of high-tech Canadian engineering and manufacturing jobs. More importantly, strategically, it would essentially surrender Canada's ability to ever build its own warships again. You would become permanently reliant on foreign nations to build and maintain your most vital defense assets. If the rupture means Canada must guarantee its own sovereignty, outsourcing its shipyards kind of contradicts that goal.
Yeah, you can't outsource your security system to the neighbor you just admitted you don't fully trust. That brings everything full circle.
Okay, so we've established the high-end fleet, whether it ends up being domestically built River-class ships or high-tech imports. But a navy is only as good as where it can operate, and that shifts our focus to Canada's most vulnerable, rapidly changing frontier, the Arctic.
Right.
And here is where the assumptions of the last century completely fall apart. We traditionally think of the Arctic as this impenetrable shield of solid ice. But as it melts, navigating it becomes incredibly complex. We are trying to figure out if we need heavily armed warships playing icebreaker or glorified police boats carrying cruise missiles.
The Arctic operating concept is perhaps the most fiercely debated aspect of the RCN's entire future. Vice Admiral Topshee has publicly stated he wants future naval vessels, specifically the corvettes and potentially the new submarines, to have Polar Class 6 or PC-6 ice edge capability. He wants a fleet of combatants that are not afraid to push into the ice floes to assert sovereignty. But Adam Lajeunesse vehemently pushes back on this in his briefing note. He essentially argues that forcing a high-end warship to be an icebreaker ruins the warship. Break down the physics of that for me. Why can't a destroyer just push through some ice?
It comes down to an engineering zero-sum game. You can't just slap an ice-capable sticker on a frigate. Giving a ship PC-6 capability means fundamentally altering its naval architecture. First, you need what's called an ice belt. This is a band of vastly thicker, heavier steel hull plating around the waterline to resist the crushing force of the ice.
Okay.
To support that heavy steel, you need internal framing that is much closer together and substantially thicker. You need hardened propellers, reinforced shafts, and specialized rudders so the ice doesn't just snap them off.
And all of that extra steel means massive amounts of weight and drag.
Exactly. Weight and drag are the absolute enemies of a fast, agile warship. You sacrifice top speed and open ocean fuel efficiency. Furthermore, it changes the shape of the ship. An icebreaker typically uses a more rounded, spoon-like bow. It rides up onto the ice and uses its sheer weight to crush downward. A warship uses a sharp, knife-like bow to slice cleanly through open ocean waves.
So what happens if you put a heavy spoon bow on a warship?
When a heavy, rounded bow hits open ocean swells, it slams into the waves rather than slicing through them. This makes the ship incredibly uncomfortable for the crew, it limits their ability to launch helicopters in rough seas, and critically, it causes cavitation and massive underwater noise.
Ah, the cavitation.
Right, and noise is a death sentence in anti-submarine warfare. If you are trying to hunt a highly advanced, ultra-quiet Russian or Chinese submarine in the deep waters of the North Atlantic, you cannot be driving a noisy, sluggish, overweight ship.
So Lajeunesse is arguing that by trying to make a ship good at everything, we make it terrible at its primary job. We are preparing for the wrong war in the wrong place.
Yes. His strategic point is that high-intensity, kinetic warfare, a shooting war against peer adversaries like Russia or China, is highly unlikely to happen under the Arctic ice. The ice makes complex naval maneuvers almost impossible. If a major conflict erupts, the critical battlegrounds will be the sea lines of communication in the open waters of the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. That is where you desperately need fast, stealthy, highly maneuverable destroyers. Over-engineering them for the Arctic ice actively degrades their primary warfighting function.
But the threat in the Arctic is undeniably real. The ice is melting, new shipping lanes are opening up, and foreign actors are moving in. If the destroyer shouldn't go up there, what is the plan?
We have to define the threat accurately. The threat in the Arctic isn't a Chinese carrier strike group launching cruise missiles at Baffin Island. The immediate threat consists of what defense planners call constabulary or gray zone tactics.
Give me a real-world example of a gray zone threat.
It is a Chinese research vessel conducting unauthorized seabed surveys in Canadian territorial waters to map resource deposits. It is a massive, state-subsidized illegal fishing fleet depleting fish stocks. It is covert underwater operations designed to tamper with or cut subsea telecommunication cables. These are acts of sabotage, resource theft, and sovereignty violation. They fall short of an act of war, making them incredibly difficult to respond to.
But you don't need an $84 billion stealth destroyer to chase away an illegal fishing trawler or monitor a research ship.
Precisely. Which brings us to the Arctic Offshore Patrol Vessels, the AOPVs, also known as the Harry DeWolf class. Canada currently has these ships. They are specifically built with the heavy steel and the reinforced bows needed for the ice. They are phenomenal at navigating the high north. The problem, they are massively underarmed.
Right. The briefing notes point out they basically just have a 25 millimeter chain gun, which is fine if you need to fire a warning shot across the bow of a stubborn fishing boat, but it's completely useless if that research vessel turns out to be armed or if a hostile drone approaches. The proposed fix in the documents is fascinating. They suggest upgrading these existing AOPVs to what they call constabulary plus status.
It is a highly pragmatic, cost-effective solution. The AOPVs are large ships with plenty of open deck space. Instead of forcing your delicate, high-end frigates to drive into the crushing ice, you take the ships already optimized for the ice and you give them teeth. And you do it using containerized modular weapons.
This is the glorified police boat carrying cruise missiles concept. Explain how you bolt a missile onto an icebreaker.
Modern naval weapons are increasingly self-contained. You don't need to cut deep into the ship's hull to install complex magazines. You can literally bolt a launcher for naval strike missiles onto the deck, giving the ship an over-the-horizon anti-ship capability. You can drop a self-contained 4-cell Mk-41 vertical launch system onto the reinforced deck space to fire larger interceptors. You can weld a CRAM point defense system, which is an automated radar paired with short-range missiles, onto the superstructure to shoot down incoming drones or limited missile attacks.
So you take a ship that already survives the ice and you upgrade its lethality just enough to handle gray zone escalation.
Exactly. This is brilliant strategic division of labor. It frees up your wildly expensive river-class destroyers to stay in the deep, open waters where they belong, hunting submarines and providing wide-area air defense, while the upgunned AOPVs handle sovereignty enforcement in the high north.
That makes perfect sense. Keep the finely tuned sports car on the open highway and put a much bigger engine and a heavy bumper on your off-road vehicle. So we've got the AOPVs up north in the ice, and we've got the river-class destroyers out in the deep blue water of the Atlantic and Pacific. But what protects the immediate coastlines? What patrols the St. Lawrence Seaway, the approaches to Halifax Harbor, or the Strait of Juan de Fuca near Vancouver? If a drone or a small submarine slips past the deep-water destroyers, who is guarding the driveway? This brings us to a terrifying gap in the plan: the missing middle.
It is a critical, immediate vulnerability. For the last 30 years, the RCN relied on a fleet of 12 Kingston-class maritime coastal defense vessels, the MCDVs, for this exact role. They were slow, but they were ever-present, doing coastal patrols, mine-sweeping, and route surveys.
Yeah.
But starting in late 2025, the Navy is officially paying off and retiring the first of these ships without an immediate replacement ready to sail. That creates a massive 7-ship capability deficit right on Canada's most immediate doorstep.
And the solution they are scrambling to finalize is a brand new class of ship called the Continental Defense Corvette, or the CDC. Tell us about the design target for this ship.
The Navy is aiming for a vessel displacing roughly 2,500 to 3,500 tons. They want it capable of speeds over 25 knots to intercept fast-moving threats and armed with a standard 76mm naval gun. It is not as massive or heavily armed as a destroyer, but it is vastly more capable, faster, and more survivable than a simple patrol boat.
The leading contender mentioned in the sources is the Vigilance class proposed by Vord Marine. It's a ship about 100 meters long, but the defining feature of this corvette isn't its hull or its engine, it is its internal architecture. The entire ship is built around the concept of modularity. I've heard this described as the Legoification of naval warfare. Walk us through how that actually works.
The Lego analogy is perfect. Historically, when you built a warship, you hardwired its capabilities into the steel. You built a dedicated sonar room. You built a permanent bay for mine-sweeping cables, and you built a specialized armory for special forces. The ship was locked into its role. The Vigilance class proposes throwing that out and using a system called the SH Defense Cube.
So instead of buying a Swiss Army knife where you are permanently stuck with the 6 tools it came with, you're buying a blank handle and you just snap in a saw blade or a screwdriver, depending on what you woke up needing to do.
Precisely. The ship features a massive open mission deck. The specialized military capabilities are housed inside standard 20-foot shipping containers, sea cans. If intelligence dictates that the mission this month is hunting sea mines in the approaches to a major port, a crane on the dock drops the subsea mine hunting module container onto the open deck. You plug standard power and data cables from the ship into the container, and suddenly the Corvette is a dedicated minesweeper.
And what if the threat changes?
That is the genius of modularity. Next month, if an Allied sensor network detects an enemy submarine lurking near the coast, you sail back to port. The crane lifts the mine-hunting module off and drops in an anti-submarine warfare suite.
The documents mention the CAPTAS-2 variable depth sonar for this. I asked earlier about tracking tiny missiles, but I want to understand this too. What makes a sonar variable depth, and why is that necessary to hunt a submarine?
It comes down to oceanography. The ocean is not a uniform pool of water. It has distinct thermal layers called thermoclines, where the water temperature drops drastically. Sound waves, which is what sonar uses to see underwater, actually bounce off these temperature changes. A clever submarine commander will dive their boat directly beneath a cold thermal layer. If a warship uses a traditional sonar mounted directly to its hull near the surface, the sound waves bounce off the thermal layer and reflect back up. The warship is completely blind to the submarine hiding below.
So the thermal layer acts like an acoustic mirror.
Exactly. A variable depth sonar solves this. It is a massive acoustic array that is physically towed behind the ship on a long cable. The ship can use a winch to lower the sonar array deep into the water, punching through the thermal layer. Suddenly, the submarine has nowhere to hide. So back to our Corvette. By dropping that variable depth sonar module onto the deck, your coastal patrol boat becomes a lethal subhunter overnight. It allows the Navy to dynamically change the ship's DNA based on the immediate threat, which is incredibly cost-effective.
It sounds incredibly adaptable, but there's a massive controversy brewing over the design of this new Corvette, and it comes straight from the top of the Navy. Vice Admiral Topshee did not mince words when discussing the current maritime helicopter, the CH-148 Cyclone. He called it a colossal disappointment and an absolute lemon produced by Lockheed Martin and Sikorsky. Because of the maintenance nightmares and the abysmally low availability rates of the Cyclone, Topshee has stated he absolutely refuses to design this new Continental Defense Corvette around a traditional helicopter flight deck.
It is exceptionally rare to hear a serving military commander be that publicly scathing about a primary multi-billion-dollar piece of equipment. But it highlights his deep operational frustration. A ship built around a massive helicopter hangar that sits empty because the aircraft is always broken is a wasted asset.
I have to push back here, though. Let's look at the mechanics of naval combat. The Earth is round. A ship's radar is limited by the physical curvature of the Earth. It can only see to the horizon maybe 15 or 20 miles away. The helicopter has always been the ship's elevated eye in the sky. It flies high, sees over the horizon, spots the enemy fleet, and can drop torpedoes miles away from the mothership. If you refuse to put a flight deck on a Corvette, aren't you effectively blinding the ship and shortening its punch? How can a Corvette survive modern combat without a helicopter?
That is the exact question traditionalists are asking. And the answer reveals a radical shift in naval doctrine. Topshee isn't blinding the ship. He is abandoning the crewed helicopter in favor of an extreme reliance on uncrewed systems. The vision for the Continental Defense Corvette is that it will not act as a traditional self-contained warship. It will serve as a heavily armed mothership for a concept called manned-unmanned teaming, or MUMT.
MUMT. Unpack the mechanics of manned-unmanned teaming for me. How does this replace the helicopter?
Instead of a massive heavy hangar taking up half the ship to house a Cyclone helicopter and its aviation fuel, the Corvette will dedicate that space to a highly advanced digitized operations and communication center. This room is designed to control a swarm of autonomous drones across 3 domains: in the air, on the surface, and underwater.
Let's start with the air. How do they see over the horizon without a flight deck?
The sources mention platforms like the Bell V-247. This is a one-way independent VTOL drone, vertical takeoff and landing. It has tilt rotors, meaning it takes off straight up like a helicopter, but then the rotors tilt forward and it flies fast like a fixed-wing plane. Because it doesn't carry human pilots, life support systems, or heavy crash gear, it is relatively small. It doesn't need a massive deck. It can be launched from the modular deck space, stay airborne for hours or even days, providing 24/7 radar and optical surveillance. It serves as that eye in the sky, and it can even be armed with sonobuoys and lightweight torpedoes.
So it does the exact job of the Cyclone helicopter, but without risking human pilots and requiring less maintenance space. What about underwater?
Below the waves, the Corvette can deploy systems like the Endural Dive XL. This is an extra-large, autonomous underwater vehicle. It looks like a miniature submarine, uses an advanced all-electric powertrain. The Corvette can launch it, and the Dive XL can conduct long-duration seabed surveys, hunt for magnetic mines, or even loiter in a strait carrying AI-enabled torpedoes. It communicates its findings back to the mothership via acoustic data links, all while the Corvette stays safely over the horizon.
The sources also mention surface drones, and this part frankly blew my mind. They detail the Aircat Bengal. It's an autonomous boat with a 1,000 nautical mile range. It only requires 5 to 7 crew members, or it can be operated entirely autonomously by computers. The notes say it can carry cruise missiles or deploy kamikaze drone swarms. It sounds like science fiction, but this is the actual technology they are designing the CDC to command.
It represents a fundamental shift in how we view risk and sea power. You are taking the human sailor out of the most dangerous, dull, and dirty tasks. You send the robotic perimeter out to do the hunting, the scanning, and the dyeing, while the Corvette acts as the central nervous system, processing the data and authorizing the strikes.
It is wild to think about, but as we pivot to technology, it exposes a whole new layer of vulnerability. We are debating $84 billion destroyers and robotic drone swarms, but the Achilles heel of this entire grand plan could be things we can't even see with the naked eye. This brings us to a series of critical capability gaps identified by the Naval Association of Canada. Let's start with the invisible battleground of the electromagnetic spectrum, or the EMS.
Modern naval combat isn't just about who has the biggest gun or the fastest missile. It is entirely dependent on who controls the airwaves. Every single system on a modern ship, the SPY-6 radar tracking ballistic missiles, the secure radios coordinating the drone swarm, the guidance systems steering the interceptor missiles, relies on access to very specific, uncorrupted frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum. If an adversary jams your frequency, or if your frequency is cluttered with noise, your multi-billion-dollar stealth destroyer is deaf, blind, and defenseless.
But the threat highlighted in the briefing books isn't just Russian electronic warfare planes jamming us. The threat to our radar is commercial cell phones. How is that even possible?
Think of the electromagnetic spectrum like a massive, multi-lane highway. Different technologies are assigned different lanes by government regulators so they don't crash into each other. For decades, the military had wide, empty lanes reserved for their high-powered radars. But in the civilian world, the demand for data has exploded. Telecommunications companies are rolling out 5G and developing 6G networks. Consumers want faster download speeds, seamless streaming, and instant app connectivity. To deliver that, the telecom companies are desperate for more bandwidth. They are aggressively lobbying governments worldwide to auction off higher frequency bands. Specifically, they want access to the 3 to 9 gigahertz range.
And why is the military pushing back so hard on giving up that lane?
Because the Royal Canadian Navy absolutely requires the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz range. That specific lane is vital for the brand new ANSPY-7 radars being installed on the River-class destroyers and for their electronic warfare systems.
How does a cell phone physically blind a warship's radar? I still don't understand the mechanics of the interference.
Radar works by listening for an incredibly faint echo bouncing back from a target hundreds of miles away. It requires a pristine, quiet background environment. If commercial 5G cell towers and millions of mobile devices are allowed to broadcast powerful signals and frequencies immediately adjacent to the radar's frequency, the signals bleed over. It raises the noise floor. It's like trying to listen for a pin drop in a quiet room, but someone suddenly turns on a jet engine next door. The radar-sensitive receivers are overwhelmed by the commercial noise.
So the radar's ability to detect an incoming stealth missile is degraded because the background noise is too high.
Exactly. The military calls it harmful interference. The briefing notes explicitly state that if commercial 5G networks are allowed to encroach on this bandwidth, military radar effectiveness drops to unacceptable risk levels. The ship might not see the incoming missile until it is too close to shoot down. It is a literal, high-stakes turf war over invisible real estate between national defense and consumer convenience.
That is terrifying. The idea that a teenager downloading a 4K video could theoretically degrade a destroyer's missile defense radar. Now, speaking of invisible signals, let's talk about communications in the Arctic. We just discussed upgunning the AOPV so they can patrol the high north. But Petty Officer First Class Doug Theedum points out a glaring infrastructure flaw. Once these ships cross the Arctic Circle, they basically lose their internet connection. Why?
It is a critical failure of orbital geometry. The RCN currently relies heavily on leasing secure bandwidth from United States military satellites, specifically the WGS constellation. The problem is that these massive communication satellites are placed in geostationary orbit. That means they sit directly over the equator. From the equator, they have excellent line-of-sight coverage of the middle latitudes. But as you travel further north, the curvature of the Earth gets in the way. Once you cross the 65th parallel, and certainly north of the Arctic Circle, The signal drops off drastically or disappears entirely.
And the vast majority of the Canadian Arctic archipelago is north of that line. So a Canadian command ship, heavily armed, patrolling Canadian territorial waters to assert sovereignty, cannot reliably send an email or stream tactical data back to headquarters in Ottawa.
That is the operational reality today. Now, the Canadian Coast Guard navigates this dead zone by using commercial Starlink terminals. Starlink uses thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit, which provide great polar coverage.
If the Coast Guard is using Starlink, why doesn't the Navy just buy a bunch of Starlink dishes and bolt them to the destroyers?
Because Starlink is a civilian commercial network. It is unsecure. A naval warship cannot transmit classified tactical data targeting information for missiles or sensitive submarine acoustic intelligence over a commercial internet connection that could be intercepted or shut down by a private company.
So what is the fix? We are spending billions on ships that will be deaf in our own waters.
The long-term Canadian plan is to build a sovereign, military-grade enhanced polar communications satellite system. But aerospace procurement is painfully slow. That constellation won't be ready until 2035 at the earliest. In the interim, Thedom's recommendation is a strategic partnership with Eutelsat, a European communications company owned by the British and French governments. Eutelsat operates an existing constellation of low Earth orbit satellites that provide polar coverage. Canada could lease secure access from these allied governments, ensuring sovereign-controlled encrypted communications almost immediately. Because a warship that cannot communicate with its commanders or its drone swarms is effectively just an expensive target.
And speaking of targets, we need to talk about the physical weapons that threaten these ships and the weapons they use. We often fixate on high-tech hypersonic missiles, but the briefing notes emphasize two very traditional yet devastating aspects of naval warfare that Canada is currently failing at: naval surface fire support and sea mines. Let's look at fire support first. Sergeant Alec Rembowski authored a note pointing out that Canada completely lacks the ability to coordinate naval gunfire with land forces. What does that mean in practice?
This is a glaring doctrinal gap. Let's paint a scenario. Imagine the Canadian Army or Canadian Special Operations Forces are deployed to a hostile coastal environment, say a little combat zone in the Indo Pacific or the Baltics. They are on the beach, advancing inland, and they are suddenly pinned down by heavy enemy artillery or a fortified bunker. The traditional lifeline in joint military operations is to call in a massive barrage from an Allied destroyer parked 10 miles offshore. That ship can rain down highly accurate 5-inch explosive shells. That is naval surface fire support.
Okay, that sounds like a standard military maneuver. What's the problem?
The problem is that Canada has never developed the institutional mechanism to actually coordinate this. You can't just have a private on the radio guessing coordinates and yelling at a ship. You need highly trained specialists called naval gunfire liaison officers embedded with the infantry. They understand the ballistics of naval guns, the trajectory over terrain, and the precise communication protocols to talk to the ship's combat center. Canada does not have a dedicated cadre of these officers. We rely 100% on the United States Marine Corps to train our artillery personnel on how to talk to a ship.
Wait, really? So if our army is pinned down and a Canadian ship is offshore, but there isn't an American-trained liaison officer around, we can't effectively call in fire from our own Navy.
Precisely. We lack the joint force synergy. If Canada is serious about its go-it-alone posture, it cannot rely on American training pipelines for basic combat coordination. The military must build a domestic capability where the RCN, the Army, and Special Operations Command practice seamlessly integrating maritime firepower into land operations.
That is a staggering oversight, and it leads perfectly into the final invisible threat: sea mines. Rembowski points out that while the media worries about sophisticated ballistic missiles, the reality in the Black Sea with the war in Ukraine and in the Red Sea with Houthi rebels is the massive proliferation of cheap, deadly sea mines. How do sea mines actually work, and why are they such a massive problem for the modern fleet?
Sea mines are the ultimate asymmetrical weapon. A high-end anti-ship missile costs $2 or $3 million. A sea mine can be manufactured for a few $1,000s. They're a weapon of sea denial. You don't even have to hit a ship. Just the suspicion that a harbor is mined will shut down global shipping and freeze a Navy in port.
How do they detonate? Are they just giant floating spike balls like in old movies?
Some contact mines still exist, but modern mines are incredibly sophisticated and hide on the seabed. The most dangerous are magnetic influence mines. A warship is thousands of tons of steel. As that massive steel hull moves through the Earth's natural magnetic field, it distorts it, creating its own unique, massive magnetic signature. A magnetic sea mine sits silently on the mud at the bottom of the harbor. Its sensors wait to detect that specific magnetic disturbance overhead. When the ship passes, the mine detonates a massive explosive charge directly upward, breaking the keel of the ship.
And the briefing notes point out that the Kingston-class vessels, which we are retiring, failed miserably at their job of minesweeping.
Because of how they were built. A true, dedicated minesweeper is often built out of wood or fiberglass to ensure it has almost zero magnetic signature. It can safely sail over a magnetic mine without triggering it. The Kingston class, however, were built to commercial steel standards to save money. Their inherent magnetic signature made them highly vulnerable to the very weapons they were supposed to be hunting.
Yeah.
Furthermore, their one-size-fits-all coastal patrol design compromised the heavy winches and gear needed for towing complex sweeping equipment.
So if a hostile actor, a foreign submarine, or even a disguised merchant vessel drops a dozen cheap magnetic mines into the approaches of Halifax Harbor or the Port of Vancouver, we have a massive problem.
We do. Well, the Navy's plan for the new Continental Defense Corvette is to use remote, autonomous drone subs to hunt mines, keeping the mothership away from the danger zone. Rembowski argues strongly that this isn't enough. Drone technology is great, but Canada needs a dedicated, specialized class of mine-sweeping vessels specifically designed for the tedious, incredibly dangerous job of local defense of Canadian waterways. You cannot rely on a multi-purpose corvette that might be busy doing coastal patrol to suddenly pivot and clear a vital shipping lane in an emergency.
It is a profoundly sobering thought. We are planning a 55-ship fleet of ultra-modern $84 billion technology, but that entire fleet could be thwarted by a lack of satellite bandwidth, interference from a 5G cell phone tower, a lack of communication with the Army, or a rusty metal spear packed with explosives resting in the mud of a harbor. But let's move from the hardware and the invisible spectrum to the most critical component of all, the software. And by software, I mean the human beings. Let's look at the human element and interagency synergy. You can build 55 highly advanced ships, but if no one is there to sail them, they are just expensive museum pieces.
This has been the existential dread of naval planners for over a decade. It is often referred to as the tyranny of small numbers. The Royal Canadian Navy has been operating at the massive, crippling personnel shortage, hovering around a 20% vacancy rate.
What does a 20% vacancy rate actually look like on a ship?
It creates a brutal, vicious cycle. When a ship is missing 1 in 5 of its required sailors, the mission doesn't go away. The remaining sailors simply have to work harder to cover the gaps, they stand more watches, they get less sleep, and they are deployed away from their families more frequently. It leads to severe burnout. When highly trained, experienced sailors burn out, they release from the military and find civilian jobs. That makes the vacancy rate even worse, putting even more pressure on the ones who stay. It has been a death spiral for readiness.
But reading through the personnel data in the sources, there is actually a massive ray of hope here. According to the data, recruitment in the 2025-2026 fiscal year suddenly hit a 30-year high, bringing in over 7,300 new members to the Canadian Armed Forces. What caused this sudden massive turnaround in recruitment?
A major factor is an initiative called the Naval Experience Program, or the NEP. It is a brilliant, innovative reimagining of military recruitment. Historically, if an 18-year-old wanted to join the Navy, they had to sign a daunting, multi-year binding contract, and they had to pick a highly specific technical trade, like sonar operator or marine engineer, before they even fully understood what that job entailed. It was an intimidating barrier to entry.
How does the Naval Experience Program change that?
The NEP lowers the barrier. It allows a recruit to sign up for a single, one-year contract. During that year, they receive a full salary, they undergo basic training to learn the military culture, and then they are sent to a ship. But instead of being locked into one job, they get to shadow multiple different trades. They spend a week in the engine room, a week on the bridge, a week in the galley. They get a tangible taste of the naval lifestyle, the camaraderie, and the mission without the terrifying long-term commitment hanging over their head.
It's basically a fully paid, immersive internship for naval warfare.
Exactly. And the data shows the retention rate has been phenomenal. The Navy set a target to retain 80% of these participants after their one-year trial concluded. They are hitting that metric. It proves a vital point. The naval lifestyle and the mission of defending the country are actually deeply compelling to young people if you can just get them through the door without overwhelming them with bureaucracy and rigid commitments up front.
That is fantastic news, but solving the personnel crisis isn't just about recruiting new sailors off the street. It's about radically restructuring how the government uses the personnel and the maritime assets it already has. And this brings us to what might be the biggest bureaucratic earthquake in the entire briefing stack. The Canadian Coast Guard is formally becoming a special operating agency under the Department of National Defense.
This is a brilliant, long overdue realization of interagency synergy. Historically, the Canadian Coast Guard reported to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the civilian ministry. The Navy, obviously, was under the Department of National Defense.
So you had two massive fleets of government ships operating in the exact same waters, but completely siloed.
Precisely. They were friendly, but they operated in parallel universes. They had entirely different operational budgets, different secure IT networks, different command structures, and completely separate physical infrastructure.
It sounds like a massive corporate restructuring. You have two giant departments that used to act like polite neighbors who occasionally waved at each other over the fence, but they kept their doors locked. And now management has realized they are doing the same job, so they are finally tearing down the fence, sharing the same database, the same IT team, and the same parking garage to get the job done.
That is a very accurate assessment of the merger. By moving the Coast Guard under the umbrella of D&D, several critical strategic synergies are immediately unlocked. First, the Coast Guard is formally given a mandate for national security surveillance. Coast Guard vessels are out on the water every single day, breaking ice in the Arctic, maintaining navigation buoys, conducting search and rescue. They have eyes on the coast constantly. By bringing them under D&D, they are formally transformed into auxiliary surveillance nodes for the military.
How did that actually work practically? Do they put guns on the red and white ships?
No, they don't militarize the ships with weapons. But to enable this surveillance mandate, naval fleet maintenance facilities, the military dry docks, will begin refitting Coast Guard ships with classified, military-grade surface search radars and secure communication suites.
So a civilian Coast Guard icebreaker suddenly becomes a forward-deployed high-tech sensor node feeding targeting data back to the Navy.
Yes. All that classified data will now feed directly, in real time, into the Shared Maritime Security Operations Centers, or MSOCs. Furthermore, the merger pools massive physical infrastructure. Vice Admiral Tofshe noted a ridiculous situation in St. John's Harbor, Newfoundland. The Navy and the Coast Guard literally share a physical property line on the waterfront. But for years, they couldn't coordinate upgrading the crumbling jetty because of impenetrable bureaucratic red tape between two different government ministries. Now, as a single entity, they pooled their budgets, build the modern infrastructure they both desperately need, and optimize refit schedules in the dry docks. It is a massive force multiplier for Canadian sea power without having to buy a single new ship.
It is efficiency born of absolute necessity. And that really brings us to the synthesis of this entire deep dive. When you step back from the individual data points and look at the sheer ambition of the Royal Canadian Navy's 2026 Strategic Review, it is breathtaking in its scale. We are talking about acquiring a dozen air-independent propulsion submarines that can hide for weeks. We are committing to 15 massive $84 billion River-class destroyers. We are developing a brand new class of 20 modular continental defense corvettes that swap out weapons like Lego bricks. We are upgunning the Arctic Patrol Fleet with cruise missiles. We are merging entirely with the Coast Guard, and we are fighting invisible wars in the electromagnetic spectrum against commercial cell networks. It is a bold, undeniably aggressive declaration. It is Canada looking at a world where old alliances are fraying and saying, we will guarantee our own sovereignty.
It is the architectural blueprint for a middle power, refusing to become a geopolitical victim. It is a recognition that the end of history is over, and hard power is returning to the oceans. But as we close, I want to leave you with a final, perhaps unsettling concept to ponder. We spent an hour discussing the immense steel platforms, the explosive physics, and the desperate need for human sailors. But as the RCN leans heavily into extreme automation to solve its personnel crisis, whether it's the Japanese Mogami class running a massive frigate with only 90 crew members, or the completely uncrewed Rafael Protector surface vessels, or the autonomous Dive XL submarines hunting mines alone in the dark, we are rapidly approaching a historical tipping point.
A tipping point in what sense? What do you mean?
What happens to the deeply ingrained naval tradition, to the ethos of the mariner, and to the very definition of sea power itself, when the vast majority of a nation's fleet has absolutely no human beings aboard? Imagine a future, and based on these documents, it is a future not very far from now, where the defense of the world's longest coastline is commanded entirely by digital networks and artificial intelligence. The lethal decisions are processed by algorithms, and the physical ships are monitored by a handful of technicians sitting at a desk in a windowless room in Ottawa, thousands of miles away from the saltwater. Is taking the human out of the line of fire the ultimate achievement of national security, or does it introduce a terrifying new kind of vulnerability?
That is a haunting thought to end on. Your house is perfectly protected, the alarm system is flawless, but the guard dogs are all autonomous robots, and you're just watching the security cameras from the basement, hoping the Wi-Fi doesn't drop. I want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We've covered an immense amount of ground in deep ocean today. Keep questioning the world around you, look past the headline numbers, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.